What's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. It's me, your host, Daniel, and I'm not joined at the desk, as I always am, by the Saruman to my worm tongue, Samuel David Camp. I am joined by my brother. Mike is here, flying in all the way from Canada, just to be with me on the Collision Live. So how you doing? We've shared stories about you, I think, here before, but in the flesh.
Send help. I'm being held here against my will.
Yeah, blink twice if you don't want to be here.
No, it is good to be here. I watch your channel and love what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so hey, that's where we know where all those dislike on all our videos come from. The minute we post our video, but it is me and you, like, we text all the time about cultural stuff. We talk about, you know, this like Star Wars and Rings of Power and just like wider trends and kind of engaging with culture. So my brother was in town. Sam is on a 1-episode probation, so he is not here. So I thought, hey, why not just pull my brother in, kind of film some of us talking. So this is gonna be again, if you join us every week, bit of a different kind of episode that we've done before. It's not structured in the same way, not the same kind of segments, but more just sort of a conversation. Kind of picking my brother's brain. My brother is sort of a pastor and kind of that perspective. So real quick, why don't you sort of share a bit about where you live, what you do, kind of all that stuff.
Yeah, in 2018, we moved to Victoria, British Columbia, which is on Vancouver Island. It's not Vancouver, and it's not Victoria Island, as people think, but it's a beautiful city. And we moved there to plant a church, and we haven't planted a church before, and so it's a lot of new for us. But yeah, I have 4 kids, and we only had 2 when we moved there, and so we're planting a church called Canvas Church in Victoria, British Columbia, and it's been quite an adventure. We've seen lots of miracles and a lot of cool things, but it's also a hard place to.
Yeah, because what is the? I'm sure you've told me before, and I'm assuming you probably know it off the top of your head. Like, what is sort of like the breakdown as far as like religion and Christians? Like, do you know the numbers for some of that?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head the specific numbers, but I do know that Victoria would be one of the most secular cities in Canada. I don't know if it's the most, but one of the most. In a lot of ways, rejecting traditional religion while embracing like new spiritualities and stuff. And so not necessarily, there's a higher percentage of atheists there than you would find in other places in Canada, but also actually very highly spiritual. And so it's sort of the spiritual but not religious thing that you hear would really apply to where we are.
Yeah, which is definitely seen, even here where we're in Georgia filming, seems to be growing. So I kind of one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, one, just because it's fun to talk about stuff, have my brother in town, but also just a lot of at the Collision, a lot of the conversation me and Sam have each week, and that you guys join us for, tend to be kind of, you know, what's Hollywood doing? What's the, you know, what is like, you know, the movies, and how as Christians, oftentimes as like individuals, like, how do we make choices? How do we kind of know what's going on? You know, how do we engage with that? So I thought one of the areas that we don't maybe touch on as much as we'd like to is just as the church, as we're called to be a church, as we're a part of a church. You know, if our culture is kind of dominated by stories and visuals and kind of the arts, and so much of sort of the way that culture seems to be going. What does that mean for the church? Maybe in a negative sense, but also just like in a positive sense of this is sort of the culture that we're called to reach. And especially you, where you're doing your church, seems very much like that. So what are some ways as far as, you know, we sort of live in this sort of story-dominated culture, movies, all this kind of stuff going on. Has that influenced like the way that you've done your church or you've presented to your congregation? Or?
Yeah, well, and I mean, you would know that that stories are a huge part of how we as humans function. Psychologists are constantly finding and reaffirming that we actually understand the world in terms of story, and you know, you make sense of your experiences and the world by really understanding it as like your autobiography, like you're writing your own autobiography. And so if story is such a huge part of who we are and a huge part of how we understand the world, then the church absolutely should capitalize on that, not just to be sort of opportunists, but to say, hey, if we're gonna reach people, if we're gonna connect to people, and people understand the world in terms of stories. And of course, the Bible's full of stories, and Jesus taught using stories. And so what are some ways we can do that? Well, one of the ways, I guess, that I do it as the pastor is through my preaching, and not just by telling stories in my sermons, which I do that. I try to have a couple stories every time, but actually by structuring my sermon in the same sort of narrative structure that a typical story would use. And so rather than like giving the main point up front and then spending the next 35 minutes unpacking that main point, I try to start with a question, sort of disrupt the equilibrium a little bit, like the bad guys crashing into the Shire or something, and sort of take something and disrupt it a bit, bring up a question or an issue, and then rather than give the answer right away, actually launch a bit on a journey, take some wrong turns along the way. Well, what about this as the answer? Well, no, that can't be right because of this. What about this? This is what the world tells us, but that doesn't really work. And actually try to get to a place almost of desperation. Like, so what is the answer? Like hold that tension with the people, and then show them how Jesus is the answer. Because at church, that Jesus is going to be the answer, but you don't know necessarily how he's going to be the answer. Like, okay, so here's the question, here's the issue. I know that the end point is going to be Jesus, but how are we going to get there? Like, what's actually the link that links Jesus to this question? And so that would be sort of that big conflict at the end that a story has is Jesus ends up being the hero that saves the day of every sermon. And then you have the resolution, which would sort of be your application. Like, so how, in light of that, how do we go on to live from there? And in one sense, it's trying to say, like, if our brains are formatted to like understand things in story, then how do we use that structure in the church? And for me, one way I try to do it every week is by trying to actually structure my sermons in a way that feels like I'm taking people with me, like on a journey, instead of just, because if you give them the answer right at the beginning, then it's like, well, why do we need to listen to the rest? So you sort of want to hold some mystery and save it to the end, which is what good stories do, which is why we stick with stories to the end.
And I like it too, because one of the things that we've talked about here at the Collision Live, and that we've written about like on the Collision, is like one of the tendencies sometimes we have as Christians when we try and kind of tap into, or whatever language you want to use for like the arts or stories, is that we almost reduce them down to like a tool, like it's or like a gimmick almost of, like all the sermon series is always, like the 12 disciples, the original Avenger. Like we're just trying like, play off of pop culture. And even like with stories, I think like obviously we know from Hollywood and stuff, like stories and like that we're impacted, that stories move us. But I feel like a lot of ways the way we incorporate that is almost like, therefore just tell a funny story that even if it doesn't connect to the thing, it's now we have a story because people like stories, like people like visuals, so just throw a visual, a PowerPoint, but kind of like what you're
almost like an afterthought. Like, I don't want to bore them too much, so better throw a story in there or tie it somehow to a story that they know, but it's not really like the driving force.
You're almost like adding it on to like, we have what we're going to say, or how we're going to say it, like what's to sort of sprinkle this in so that people feel like to appease the more visual or narrative people where I feel like where you're coming at with your church is more like, like the stories are big and like dominant because they reflect something about the way we understand the world, and like it's not just sprinkling a story so that because people like that stuff. Like this is actually even science and all the stuff sort of is saying like this is what moves people. Like, so how can we kind of tap into that and relate in a way that kind of makes sense?
Well, and if there's any, I don't know if there's any pastors watching or people who want to sort of dive into that a bit more, there's a good book called The Narrative Plot. It's an older book. I think it was written before we were born, but it's just great. And it gets into a lot of the, how do you structure a sermon following the same sort of structure as a story, called The Narrative Plot. And I learned a lot from that about, not just an afterthought, but actually being intentional about how you approach it.
Yeah, well, and if it was written before you were born, it is an old book. This book...
I think it's a 1980 or something, which maybe someone who's watching is like, that's not old. But for others, that's ancient.
But maybe what are some other ways? 'Cause I know you shared even with me a little bit about kind of using like visuals or some of the, I guess, the arts. Not just like high art or whatever, but like
Yeah.
just sort of what's going on and using visuals in a way that to kind of supplement or connect or spread or spark discussions. Which again, if you follow the collision, kind of conversations is sort of the buzzword that we throw around. But what are some other ways that you've maybe done that?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that we try to do at our church. One is about once a month or so, we've got an artist who comes and paints, and actually starts with a blank canvas, and then based on what is said in the service time. So that the music usually based most around the sermon time, but he starts at the very beginning with the music. Paints a visual depiction of something inspired by what is preached on. And so it's pretty cool to watch a blank canvas and then slowly that transforms into this visual reminder of what was preached on. And so we actually have those like kind of displayed all around on our Sunday gatherings. And so you should be able to look at these things and remember, oh yeah, like I remember that, or I remember this story that was told, or this message. And actually a lot of people have even bought those. If it was really impactful, they've actually bought them. And we actually have a couple of those hanging in our house as a reminder of a specific, maybe a Sunday that was really meaningful to us and where God really spoke to us. And it's this visual reminder. And something else I tried this for the first time. I was speaking at a youth camp, and I was speaking 5 different times, and at the end of each time I had some sort of visual prop, and I used it as kind of an example of what I was talking about, but really at the end of the service to have like some prop that they could see and remind them. There were things like a basin of water, or like a bungee cord, or some ratchet straps. I mean, things like that. And then at the end of the week, I figured most of these teenagers probably weren't taking a lot of notes, but I knew they would have their phones. And so at the end of the week, I put them sort of in order. And we were talking about discipleship. Like all of it was like, what does it mean to be a disciple? And so I put them all in order, and then I invited them to come up and actually take a picture of all of them with their phone. Hopefully, if those visuals were kind of ingrained in them enough during that time, then when they left that place, if they want to be reminded of what does discipleship look like, what were some of the things that guy talked about, they can actually, they're going to have their phone with them and pull up that picture and look at those visual examples and hopefully be able to be reminded, this is what discipleship looks like. And because, we're not going to remember a whole lot of things, but that we hear, but visually can be pretty good triggers to remember things that we had heard.
Which is really a biblical, like what comes to mind is like Joshua leading them across the Jordan River and like taking the stones of the, a visual or like a tangible thing to remember. And like, the scripture says, anyone that sees this in generations, like tell them the stories. But I feel like the visual stuff can almost, like I was saying with the narrative stuff, like it can almost become like a grafted on add-in of like, well, we need to, we're a visual culture, so let's use a PowerPoint, and like the PowerPoint's just text of like what's the script word for word, and like it's like, well, we're trying to appeal to the more visual learners in the audience, but the idea that like visual stuff, like we are, and I feel like even more so now maybe than we have been, like very much visual people, and I think some of that's with technology and media, and like we've like almost been trained into be like visual, but I like that.
Well, you watch it too. Like, I just watch the young people in our church. As soon as you put a picture on the screen, anybody who is like bored and half asleep is
wake them up.
Oh, there's something on the screen, and I mean, you even see in YouTube videos and stuff, like you change camera angles, or they do this sort of the far out, and then they kind of cut in, and they try to cut every few seconds, and it's like, how do you like reach people in short attention spans, like even to the point where it can be, like we're so used to visuals, we're so used to staring at screens that you even watch shows and stuff, and how fast they cut scenes, and YouTubers, how they're cutting scenes so quickly, And it's like, it's almost as if now that visuals have become such a big part of our culture, we're sort of like, well, are they being overused? You know, are people sort of getting bored even with visual? And so they're trying to even figure out, how do we adapt even within using visuals? How do we adapt within that? And that's a tough question, right? Because the visuals help so much. And in like a sermon or something that I'm doing, because it's mostly like audio, throwing a picture up there is great because it changes it up. But even then, you know, you have the picture up there for a few seconds and suddenly people are like, you know, what's they're sort of bored with it. And that's a tough question of how do we engage like fleeting attention spans, even through the power of visuals? Are we being like desensitized even to that?
Yeah, I think even just like one of my, which we won't get into much right now, but like one of my little soapboxes is just about like, even just like the way we structure our like sanctuaries, or we structure our, you know, whether it's like an actual physical place, or like your church, you guys rent out a space, and like, not that it has to be, you know, a cathedral kind of thing, but just the intentionality.
It's not very cathedral-like. It's just sort of an ugly community center.
Not a whole lot of stained glass windows in Mike's church. But just the intention.
There's stained windows
and floors and stained everything. But just like the intentionality of like, it's not just about like, hey, here's some kind of modern looking flashy lights that looks cool. Yeah. But like, what can we do that actually has meaning or value, or it can communicate? Yeah. Maybe another area that I know you've done a little bit on is just like with pop culture, like with movies and things, like maybe even like outside of like the sermon context. But just, you know, as me and Sam talk about every week, like movies and stuff are such conversation starters. They're such like so many of the issues or the things that like, you know, where people are, the ideologies, values, and like passions, like are just worked out through the media and through the movies, and it kind of reflects them, they shape them. How have you, if you have, like, how have you kind of navigated that, or like do you look to sort of what's going on in any way to influence how you present something, or do you stay away? What do you think on that?
Yeah, well, trying to be aware of you know, what's going to be on people's minds is probably good. You know, like what are some of the trends in pop culture? Because you assume that maybe especially with the younger demographic, that's going to be on people's minds. And so to completely ignore it, or, I mean, I try to walk a line though, because I don't want to, what they sort of call preach the headlines, you know, like I don't want to just be one who it's like everything that they're hearing everywhere else in the world, and then they come to church and then they hear more about that there. It's like you come to church and you want to hear something different, right? Like you want to, it's like where do I go to sort of go beneath the surface of all this stuff? And so there's sort of that line of like, you know, you don't necessarily want to draw too much pop culture stuff into the church because they get so much of that elsewhere, but they don't necessarily get like Bible and Jesus a lot elsewhere. But then at the same time, sort of taking advantage of that where we can. And when I was here, I was a young adult pastor in Georgia for 8 years, and I started every message to the young adults with some sort of video movie clip, and it would just introduce the topic. But it's funny because I remember one person saying to me, "Man, I'm never going to be able to watch a movie again because I'm always seeing like deeper meaning into this stuff, and I'm always, you know, I'm just sort of saying, oh, the moral of this story. Wait, what am I doing?" And that's good, you know, because movies are always have some sort of message that they're getting across, right? It's not just random visuals, like it's telling some sort of story and it's making some sort of point. And so kind of using pop culture to help aid, you know, in what you're doing. But something else that we saw is, you know, every now and then you see Christians actually doing media really well. And The Chosen has been sort of one of those things that's really taken off, and it's really interesting. And I don't know if you guys have talked much about it or not yet on the Collision, but just kind of fascinating to see how grassroots that whole thing has been. And my wife and I just watched season 1 and enjoyed it. But there's actually a group in our church that we were encouraging people to disciple each other in small groups, like really small, like 3 to 4 people to meet weekly for the next year, and really get to know each other, invest in each other's lives. And this one group was meeting in an apartment complex, just people like neighbors, like down the hallway. And there was one guy who was a Christian. He led another lady in the apartment complex to Christ. And so there was a sort of a seasoned Christian, a new Christian, and then two of their neighbors who were not Christians. And what was really interesting is the way that they approached their group was they would gather together for dinner, have a meal together, and then they would watch one of these episodes of The Chosen, and then they would go into scripture of where those episodes were sort of drawn from, and they would just chat about it and talk about it. And then they later on, when they got more comfortable with each other, they would start praying a little bit together. And they loved it. And actually, one of the ladies who would not claim to be a Christian, I actually had her share on a Sunday, sort of share a bit of testimony about that, and basically just asked her, what's the value in gathering together? What have you guys been doing? You know, what have you liked about it? And she just said, like being able to see the Bible come alive in that sort of way, and to really be able to see like the characters of this, and then have the time and space to have conversations, like you said, like to have these discussions. What she loved is like they disagree about stuff. But they're really enjoying this show, and it's just a launching pad. Like obviously The Chosen isn't on the same level as Scripture itself, but it's just a launching pad for them to talk about these things and then go to Scripture and dig in and have these conversations. And I'm thinking like, man, like when Christians do media well, it can act as such a great, launching pad to have those conversations. And she has become one of the most regular attenders of our church, right? We're still working on the other guy, but so cool to see people using the media that's out there really for discipleship.
Yeah, maybe this is my confession time that there's really no reason that I haven't, like, for me not to have watched through The Chosen. Based on like what I do and like the collision and stuff, I've been told to watch it. Everyone that has told me has enjoyed it, and like, I just haven't yet. And like, I think part of it is me still kind of combating like which I think a lot of people share, is just like, we're so jaded by a lot of that stuff.
There's been a lot of failed attempts.
That it's like, well, I'm just sort of done with that. Maybe it doesn't, like, personally, my own journey doesn't interest me as much. But I remember like hearing that story and being like, there is value in sort of presenting it a different way, and kind of,
it's not for everyone, but it's neat to see something like that being used, and not being led by like pastors or church leaders. Like it's people who may not feel totally comfortable, leading a Bible study or something in their home, but who are like, this is giving them something to connect with their neighbors over. And it's something they're not like embarrassed to show. It's not like super cheesy or anything. They're just like, hey, you can enjoy this, even if you don't believe that everything happened, like that these events they're depicting happened. You can still enjoy this and have good conversation, and and you can still walk away not being a Christian if that's kind of where you're at, but it opens up that space.
Well, and the thing is, like, the story of Jesus is such a compelling, like,
yeah,
even like it's always been, like, throughout, like, through literature and even movies and things, like biblical themes, the biblical stories, like by people that aren't professing Christians, like they're always alluding to it or including it. Like there is something that is compelling for people. It's not just sort of this sermon. I do want to maybe touch on something that you had said earlier, kind of like, the not preaching the headlines, like not doing the you have heard it said, but I say to you, here's the definitive answer on what you.
Because what the world needs is more talking heads talking about politics on their platform.
Yeah. Before we get to Scripture, let me tell you what I thought of the MCU Thor movie. But I do think, like, sort of that balance of, because one of the things I've seen, when I'm really bored and I tune into one of your church live streams, when I need to get.
It's a 3-hour difference, so it's probably past your bedtime here.
That's why I'm so sleepy when I do it. But kind of, I guess one of the things that I see you do is sort of avoiding the, which I kind of, like the trying to be like, we're relevant because we're throwing out these like references to pop culture stuff. This, like, our church, we have a finger on the pulse. But one of the things that I think you do, because you'll use like examples, either historical or books, or like tangible things, as far as like it's not just sort of pulling in whatever's going on in culture, like, into my church service to make it cool. Yeah. But that I feel like you kind of work through the issues and like prepare people to actually go out and, like, bring that with them as they watch a movie or as they read a book, like kind of the philosophies, right? The biblical teaching that, like, you know, you're not trying to like dress it up and make it trendy, but it's, you know, once you have this foundation, like go into the culture and be able to kind of be in the world and not just sort of closed off from anything that might combat what you've heard.
Well, it gives you an opportunity to show by example, like how do you take your Christian worldview and use that to, you know, to filter, maybe to filter the pop culture that comes in, and not filter meaning just, you know, what are the things with enough bad words in it that I don't want to listen to, but like filter, like understand and see it, and not just turn your brain off and kind of let it all go in and shape the way that you're thinking subconsciously. But I like to show them, hey, you see worldview stuff all the time. And I think we did our family book club read through the Count of Monte Cristo, and I was like, this is really interesting book. And I did the abridged version. If we're making confessions, the abridged version was still like 600 pages.
God will forgive you, but I don't know if I have yet.
But it's like, but to show them like, hey, there have been authors out there and filmmakers and these people who are making really good points, and they're making points really powerfully, you know. And if we in church are trying to communicate truth, why not draw from some of the best communicators in history, whether it's a filmmaker or an author or what have you? It's like, draw from these guys, because something like the Count of Monte Cristo makes so many good and very biblical points, to where it's like, man, like, rather than trying to come up with my own all the time, here's somebody who gave a powerful example. And so you can kind of summarize their story or something, or quote them or do something. And it shows people like, hey, look, like pop culture is not meant to be mindless. It actually can be very powerful. And I hope that whenever I use an example or draw from a movie or something, it sort of shows, almost in real time, it shows people how to dissect it a little bit and to dig in and say, like, what's the worldview or the truth being you know, given in this. And then hopefully over time, like, they start to see things that way too, for good and for bad, right? They can kind of see maybe the messages that aren't biblical and aren't good, and be like, I kind of recognize, even though this movie is really playing on my emotions and I really want to kind of cheer, actually what I am being made to feel like sympathy for is maybe not a good thing. Like maybe this isn't something that I should support, but because of the music and because I've grown attached to this character and the movie has kind of led me this way, my emotions are like, yeah, I want to embrace that. And when maybe when I stop and think about it, it's like, well, wait a sec though, but I see what's happening, and I see that they're making a point, and I can choose to accept or reject that point, right? But you start to see the power in sort of stories and media visuals.
Because that's even like with the Collision, like that's one of our driving things, where like even like me and Sam talked about it in our last Collision Live episode, like where discernment with Christians when it comes to like entertainment and stuff has almost been reduced to like just knowing what to watch, what not to watch. Like it's more
of a filter.
It's a filter. It's not like a discerning, like as you watch, learn, like, you know, I just think a lot of Christians haven't trained the church to think about things like movies, or like to kind of bring their, you know, their faith into what they're watching and think through kind of what the story's doing and the scene. Like, because even like as we're filming it, this episode, like the most recent Rings of Power episode, like basically presents like the classical problem of evil and like sovereignty, and like I can't see it, and like this, you know,
there's lots of good stuff in there.
But just sort of those sort of issues that are kind of being worked out and thinking through beyond just sort of like knowing yes, no, like, you know, bad, good, you know, affirms what I believe, doesn't affirm what I believe, but training up kind of the church and people in the church to be able to like to actually navigate through a movie. Hey, maybe I don't agree with it, but here's why, or here's why this sort of made me think this way or not this way. Maybe just kind of anything kind of throwing you right on the spot, like just, final things, or as in your experience as a pastor, just working through it. We're both fathers. Any kind of final issues or thoughts, or?
Yeah, well, even just we're just seeing the power of stories and visuals, and and really it can be used for good or for evil. And I've got 4 kids, and they're all young, and you know, like the stuff that they watch, like they pick up on a lot of that, you know, and it's not just that they repeat words that they hear in shows or whatever else. They do that. Didn't realize how many words are in Toy Story that I don't want my kids saying, but it also actually brings up good questions, you know, and they ask questions based on things that they saw, and so you just realize like this is a powerful tool. And just like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. And so just coming to understand, like if we're wired to love and embrace stories, and if visual is one of the powerful ways that stories are told these days, then if we're called to go make disciples, and we want to be effective at making disciples, then it makes a lot of sense that we would tap into that. And I think to ignore that is to make a big mistake, because the world's not ignoring that, right? Like the world is making all sorts of stories and visuals that are shaping the way people think and feel, and so I think as the church, we need to be a part of that too, and I don't think that's like extra biblical or anything. Like, I think Jesus was intentional when he spoke in stories, and he told parables, and he used examples of flowers and fields and things that his audience would have seen and would have understood like right away, right? These powerful visuals, and so I just feel like Jesus gave us a great example, and the Bible itself is so full of narrative that I think, you know, it's one of those things the church is going to have to figure out, because the world is figuring it out, right? And not that we want to just sort of try to stay at pace with the world. That's not it at all. But it's because that's how people are wired. And if we want to love people, then we got to understand how people tick. And the way people tick is through stories. And so I think it actually gives us a great example, or a great opportunity. And I guess the last thing I would say is just maybe one of the best things we could do for people in church is teach them how to be good storytellers. That's basically what a testimony is, right? And usually I think we've taught people how to tell their testimony by giving them like the ABCs of theology of how to tell the person to become a Christian. And I just think, like, if God's always at work, right? And if God is doing things all around us, then there's all sorts of stories to be told, current stories of what God is doing all around us. And I think some people, they see some of that stuff, but they just don't know how to tell those stories to people. But it's like you're sitting in the barber's chair or whatever, and you don't have to try and think, okay, I need to give this guy the ABCs of how he can become a Christian. It's like, did you see God do something in your life last week? Tell that story. You know, did you see God do a miracle? Tell that story. And if you're not seeing God do that stuff, then maybe ask yourself, am I walking by faith in such a way that I'm seeing God at work and I'm seeing God do miracles? Because once you start seeing and experiencing that stuff, man, like, people listen to that. And they listen to that because our culture has really elevated subjective personal experience, right? Like, what I feel inside is sort of the king of everything. And so our culture has done that, right? What I feel is sort of king of everything. And so we can actually sort of take advantage of that and say, well, so let me share stories of personal experience and how I feel about them. And I think people will give us a platform to do that and say, okay, well, I'll listen to your story, and I'll actually respect your subjective experience. Even if I don't believe everything about it, I'm going to listen to that, because people love stories. And so let's teach, as part of our discipleship, let's teach people how to be good storytellers.
Yeah, and I think we even like take it for granted, I think, about like a lot of the things that kind of undergird our faith, like the experiences or the stories or the things we've seen God do miracles and work in our life and work in the life. Like, the people outside of the faith or outside of the church, like, they weren't there for those experiences that we sort of that there is sort of a sense of how do we communicate? Like, how do we, obviously with the hope that they will experience those kind of type of experiences themselves and those stories, but don't take it for granted that they don't see the God the same way. There is, I think the word you said, like opportunity. There is an opportunity there for us to include this. Well, it's been fun. It's been fun. I've been wanting to get you in here and talk about cultural stuff, pick your brain on kind of the arts and on church. Hopefully, if Sam gets put on another probation, sent out of the live stream, pull you back in and even maybe get into some more like pop culture things or some of the discussions.
Yeah, have me on to talk about Andor and Rings of Power once those are over.
Yeah, we will definitely bring you on there and sort of geek out about stuff. Take our text thread and pull that into video. I want to thank you guys for joining us. Hope that you took a lot away from Mike's experience. I encourage you guys, throw some thoughts in the comment section. If you're a pastor, if you're someone that's had experiences in the church, or just have ideas about that, or if you were brought out, if you're kind of a newer believer, we'd love to have conversations with you guys about that and sort of hear some of your perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, do all the stuff that you know to do. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.